everyone! Today we're going to be talking about John Searle's Chinese room and all of the different arguments and replies, the Turing test and all of that wrapped into one today. And we're also going to be going over the key knowledge and all of that, and also some exam questions at the end. So let's get into it. To start off with, we're going to just have a look over what does VCAR want you to know. So there's two categories. We've got the key skills and the key knowledge. In the key knowledge, we're going to look at the philosophical conceptions of artificial intelligence, including the Turing test, weak AI, and strong AI, which is all of that foundation knowledge that we need to understand the Chinese room argument. And then we also need to understand the Chinese room argument, including standard responses both for and against. So we'll cover some of those. And then for key skills, we need to describe and compare the Turing test, strong AI, and weak AI as conceptions of artificial intelligence, which again we'll cover in a second. And then we need to argue for or against the Chinese room. So we need to describe those arguments, which I feel like that's a bit repetitive, but sure, VCAR. So to start with, what is strong AI and what is weak AI? So to start with, we've got strong AI, and this is general AI. It's another name for it, and this just means something that's really, really smart, a computer that could be as smart as human intelligence. You might have heard of the term the singularity, and the singularity is the point at which AI is able to reach that human intelligence. So they're able to learn, reason, act independently, and potentially be fully self-aware. Although we'll get into what that means, that self-awareness, in a minute with how John Searle and Alan Turing define all of that. And then our other idea of AI is weak AI, also known as narrow AI. And the reason we call it narrow AI is because it doesn't have a broad understanding of things like a human does. It has a very narrow understanding of one particular thing. So it does one task really well, and it doesn't really think independently outside of that one narrow task that we ask it to do. And you're probably a lot more familiar with weak AI because we use it every day. I'll get into some examples. So for strong AI, you might be familiar with some of these characters. We've got HAL, we've got the Terminator, we have C-3PO, all of that. So those, if you think about strong AI, those are characters that are completely independent. They think on their own, they're able to communicate like humans, and they're self-aware of their situation. They're not just executing one particular task. Whereas weak AI might be an AI that plays chess. There's a lot of different examples of that and historical examples. There's ChatGPT, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and something like a Google Home Assistant or an Amazon Alexa. So those are all narrow AI because they just do one thing really well, maybe playing chess or writing out an essay. Don't do that. Or maybe responding to your requests or setting an alarm for you or understanding your voice. But your ChatGPT doesn't actually understand everything around it. You're not going to be able to get it to reason or be self-aware. Same with the robot that plays chess. It's just able to understand the chess game. It can't actually reason in any way. So those are the two different understandings. And I think that's where a lot of miscommunication in the media comes from. ChatGPT isn't going to take over the world. It's not strong AI. It just generates text. So that's what we're going to start with. And today we're going to be talking a bit more about strong AI or general AI, because we're going to be understanding what does it mean to be strong AI. Is strong AI equivalent to a human intelligence? Is it actually capable of human intelligence? And how do we know at what point we've actually reached strong AI? So our first thought behind this is the Turing test. So some of you may be familiar with Alan Turing. You might have seen him as one of the mascots for your breakout rooms. So Alan Turing was a genius. You might have seen the movie about him, The Imitation Game, which is actually named after the Turing test. So the Turing test is, Alan Turing came up with this in 1950, where he wanted to understand if a computer can think or not. And he's like, okay, we'll set up this test. It's based on this game show called The Imitation Game, in which we've got a human interrogator and we have a robot or an AI or a computer on the other end. And the interrogator will receive a response from a robot and from a human, and they have to determine which one is the human response and which one is the robot response. And the idea is if the robot is capable of fooling the human, then it probably is capable of human intelligence. The reason because we just understand what the robot's saying. If it's able to convince us that it's human, it must be human. So that's the whole idea. And so if the AI is strong, then it can convince us, which some of you might think, okay, it might be a bit fishy because all it's really doing is responding to a human, and that's what we're going to get into with the flaws in that. Okay, so I hope that you understand the Turing test. Now we're going to have a look at the Chinese room. So we were a few decades later in 1980, and this philosopher named John Searle is a bit skeptical about Alan Turing's ideas. He thinks that, well, it's not really, maybe we're just kind of listening to responses. I'm not sure about this. So he came up with this thought called the Chinese room. And the Chinese room argument is actually quite similar to the Turing test, but it's sort of meant to be a parallel to it. So we have an interrogator on the outside, and the interrogator speaks Chinese. And we have John Searle sitting in the room, and he's not able to speak, read, or understand Chinese. And our interrogator is putting in messages in Chinese, and John Searle has this massive set of books, and he's getting the response, reading the response, and then he's got an output for that response. Now, importantly, he does not translate the response into English and then translate it back. He's just saying, when I get this input, I get this output. Sort of like a bunch of if statements. So we can think about it that way. So if the interrogator can be tricked into believing that John Searle can speak Chinese through these books, then John Searle must speak Chinese, right? Well, no, because he doesn't actually understand what he's reading. And this is the problem that John Searle has with the Chinese room, with the Turing test, because the robot is just imitating a human. It doesn't actually have that thought behind it, as far as we know. So that's what John Searle has a problem with. So let's have a think about that. So, now that we understand what the Chinese room argument is, let's have a think about it. So, a lot of people had some problems with this because, sure, it kind of breaks down the Turing test a bit, but does it really answer the question that it's impossible to have strong AI? Because that's what John Searle was arguing, that it's impossible to have strong AI because a robot's simply imitating human intelligence. It's not actually capable of it. So, we had a lot of different arguments back and forth, and John Searle is very petty, and he will have something to say about every single argument that someone comes up with. Every single one. So we're going to go through some of the common replies and counter-arguments that John Searle has. And you might be asked about these on your exam, as we discuss at the front. We'll go through some of the more common ones that you're more likely to be asked about. But there's actually a massive long list of replies, and if you're asked to come up with your own reply for it, or not your own original thought, but your own argument for it, you're welcome to use some of these more obscure ones, but we'll cover some of the more important ones that you do need to know. So there's some links there if you want to have a look at that. So our first reply here is called the systems reply. So how does this go? Well, we don't say that a part of a person is self-aware, we know the whole person is. The man in the room may not understand Chinese, but the instructions in the man together are able to interpret the respond to Chinese. The whole system understands Chinese, not just the man inside. And I think that that's a pretty solid argument, in my opinion, because, maybe my tongue doesn't understand English, but my brain does. It's the whole system as a whole that's able to respond and communicate, though, and understand. And John Searle, no, he doesn't agree with that. He says that consciousness is more than a collection of ordinary physical objects like paper. He thinks that the understanding can't be stored in these books and that man translating. So he says a man could memorize the entire instructions in his head, and he's literally just translating it back and forth in his head, but he still doesn't understand it. He's not actually translating it back into a language he understands and doing it. He's just taking this input and this output. So then he is the entire system. There's no parts of the system. He is the entire system just walking around and doing that, but he still does not understand Chinese. So that's John Searle's reply to the systems argument. Our next argument is the brain simulator reply. So this reply goes, the human brain is how we form meaning, not a man with a set of instructions. If a human brain was simulated by a computer down to the neurons, it would be capable of understanding Chinese, as it is indistinguishable from a brain's operation. So they're saying, you're right, John Searle, consciousness is more than just a book. It's more than these ordinary objects. But it's neurons. So if we're able to simulate those neurons, then why is that not capable of understanding? And if you think about how a neural network works, it's actually kind of an interesting thought, isn't it? But John Searle, again, not really happy with that argument. He says it's just a simulation. A simulation is just a simulation. He said the human mental phenomena is dependent on actual physical chemical properties of the actual human brain. So he doesn't quite agree with that argument. And he has a longer thought about it.
Imagine that instead of a monolingual man in a room shuffling cymbals, we have the man operate an elaborate set of water pipes with valves connecting them. When the man receives the Chinese symbols, he looks up in the program written in English which valves he has to turn on and off. Each water connection corresponds to a synapse in the Chinese brain, and the whole system is rigged up so that after doing all the right firings, that is, after turning on all the right faucets, the Chinese answers pop out at the output end of the series of pipes. Now, where is the understanding in the system? It takes Chinese as input, it simulates the formal structure of the synapses of the Chinese brain, and it gives Chinese as output. But the man certainly doesn't understand Chinese, and neither do the water pipes. And if we are tempted to adopt what I think is the absurd view that somehow the conjunction of man and water pipes understands, remember that in principle the man can internalize the formal structure of the water pipes and do all the neuron firings in his imagination.
So our next argument is called the other mind's reply. This one's really interesting to me. So the other mind's reply goes, well, the Turing test is still valid. When we interact with other people, we have no idea what is happening in their brain. We just judge their behavior. Why should we hold a computer to a higher standard than another person? Which is interesting because I don't actually know that Freddie, for instance, is capable of consciousness or understanding or self-awareness. I'm just assuming he is because when I talk to him, he's convinced me he's a human. And that's essentially what the Turing test boils down to. So why should we be holding a computer to a higher standard than another human? We actually had a quote from Alan Turing himself, and he says, it is usual to have the complete convention that everyone thinks. He's saying it's polite to assume that everyone is capable of thought. John Searle, you're actually quite rude for assuming that people aren't capable of thoughts. And we have another thought here, and this is saying, for all I know, Searle may only be behaving as if he were thinking deeply about these matters, but even though I disagree with him, his simulation is pretty good, so I'm willing to credit him with real thought. So that was Niels Nielsen also backing up this argument. So again, it's just we're crediting people based on what we see on the surface, so why should we hold a computer to a higher standard? We're not too happy with this one. John Searle says, it's still a simulation and not capable of real understanding. He actually has a quote about how a simulation of a storm doesn't actually get you wet. It's just a simulation. It's not actually capable of that full understanding. He's sort of just doubling down on his argument from earlier. That's what John Searle has to say about it. So we've gone through a few replies now, so let's have a think about what we might be asked on the exam. So this is my prediction. I'm not going to, you can't hold me accountable to this one. But I would generally expect a longer question, usually in part B. I'd be quite surprised if you got a multiple choice, but you could. So you're probably going to have to ask to be made an argument or a counter argument. So it's going to be a longer, more worded question. So you might be asked to describe a reply, and that could be any reply that has been made before, or they might ask you about a specific reply, and you might need to form the counter argument against that. If they ask you about a specific reply, I would be surprised if it wasn't one of the ones on that list, based on past exams, but it's always good to have a look over the other ones. But there are some really obscure ones on there, so don't waste too much time on that. But it gets quite fun. And then you might also be asked to explain related concepts. Generally, that'll be about the Turing test and weak and strong AI. So, this question was from the 2022 exam, and this is a very common style of question that you might be asked about it. It'll be two people arguing about John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment, or his Chinese room argument. And this one, it says, describe how the Chinese room argument is used to argue against the possibility of strong AI. So based on that, and we want to structure it towards the question, you probably want to form an argument about how John Searle does not believe in strong AI, and talking about making those connections to the Turing test, and then also describing how strong AI, it's not really capable of real thought. But we want to explain the Chinese room thought experiment. So we're looking for 2 marks, explaining the thought experiment, and then connecting that back to the question about how it doesn't actually mean strong AI. So on the examiner's report, we had over half of people got full marks on this, 53%, but the average was still 1.4, and I think you guys can do a little better than this. So the Chinese room, so we've got a big explanation here about it, but one of the fallbacks that students had was some students wanted detail about particulars of the argument instead of going back to talking about strong AI. So we don't want to explain the entire Chinese room thought experiment. We just want to connect it back to the question. We've only got 2 marks here. It's not asking you to explain everything. So keeping it brief, don't waffle. So our other question, this is also very similar. Again, you're expecting a lot of questions where there's going to be 2 students arguing back and forth about the Chinese room. So the first one in part C here, we're asking about strong AI in the context of artificial intelligence. So we're just defining strong AI. We've got 2 marks here, and then our other is 2 marks, and this is a counter argument to the systems reply. So we remember the systems reply, which it describes a bit here, is about the system being a whole. And if we remember, the response to that is if the man was able to memorize the entire book. So again, the examiner's report showed they were actually answered pretty poorly this time, especially part D here. And this is saying that some students were able to describe the counter-argument, but were not able to understand the logic underpinning its conclusion, which is a similar complaint that they had on the last question, which is, so you can argue the argument as much as you want, but it's not really getting connected back. So just make sure you're connecting it back. That's the main problem here. Okay, what did we cover this time? We went through the Chinese argument, the Chinese room argument with John Searle. We looked at the Turing test, strong and weak AI, and we also looked at 3 common arguments and counter-arguments for the Chinese room argument. So I hope you're able to use this as revision, and if you've got any questions, make sure you ask your teacher and your tutors. Thank you.